A microcosm of corruption is what my friend Rusty had stated in 2021. 5 years ago, when that was happening, I had just been unlawfully evicted from my home, 67 Summer Street in Peterborough, New Hampshire. What I had shared with Rusty at that time as a client of Monadnock Developmental Services is that they were not permitting on any level to give me assistance with the transportation I required, or medical appointments, legal representation, and that instead they were saying that I required a guardian. This being after the hospital release in 2015, 6 years before, as my own guardian, with my actual medical condition hidden from probate court. Miraculously surviving the conditions where there was no disability modifications made to the home the local community lied to, the business continue operating with my signature being utilized by the individuals around me, telling me to go about things believing I was normal. They fooled people, even new customers from that business, to believe that I was going to be normal for my signature only. So the microcosm of corruption is focusing on how is that possible? How could a person that's disabled be dissected with their signature? And the methodology begins with medical fraud while the patient of a hospital for judicial misuse. And that's the technique that was used by my parents. So the way that they maintain that is continuous rulings that they acquire by using medical fraud. They've got medical info of me and my pedigree information. So they've had the ability to file and claim that a person that is incapacitated yet still alive requires this type of protection of their rights. And this is the banking fraud that Lynn Howard was able to get arranged with Roger's assistance. And that's been blocked with unlawful rulings that they got, stating that no one has the right to access these bank accounts or get information about them in protection of my human rights as a vulnerable citizen medically. They used this medical condition I was in and the format of the law that's meant to protect it as a weapon. With medical fraud as the patient of a hospital, they've still used the medical documentation in other avenues to create the systematic dysfunction that I've summarized as psychiatric terrorism. My parents have shown that they're part of an organized agenda that's targeting and terrorizing a vulnerable portion of the population in New Hampshire, specifically medical. Medical vulnerability is what's targeted in the organized judicial misusing, provides systematic dysfunction as well as immunity from criminal prosecution for them as they rob banks. They simply are stealing federal funding through the banks, but doing it with pens instead of guns. And they're literally killing patients of hospitals instead of tellers and customers of the bank. But it's the same honest concept. These are my blood parents willing to kill people to steal from the federal government. And they target the vulnerability of medical conditions while patients of hospitals because of the network that protects individuals with that mentality in the state of New Hampshire. The psychopathy of that willingness to treat vulnerable that way for the love of money has a network protecting it in New Hampshire is the summary of what's going on in the microcosm of corruption is showing the depth of that network that will protect people like Roger, Lynn, and Tim. When they're inhumane to patients of hospitals, the whole network protects them with organized judicial misusing. It's a shock indeed. So, on the microcosm notes, when I got here 5 years ago, that was when Monadnock Developmental Services had claimed I needed the guardian. And attorney Earl Carroll advised me to go with the guardian because I told him everything I just talked about in the documentary and all the documentation that I was finding and how they had hidden medical info while the patient of a hospital, and how I required focus specifically on that human rights violations organized by my parents and the chapter RSA 131.9 specifically about guardianship and the misuse of it, all told to Earl Carroll. Earl Carroll advised me to agree to guardianship because the guardian would take over and get the proper attorneys to address that, because I shouldn't be unlawfully evicted from my home. The defense of my home was the point to get agree to guardianship, because attorneys in the state of New Hampshire would assist me in getting back home and stopping that forced sale, because I was in the process of that unlawful eviction, which is why I arrived here 5 years ago. So I remember talking about it, probably not this clearly or calmly because of how upset I was. And my children had been pulled from the home by unlawful rulings coordinated through family court by Len Howard and Jolene Rogers. The nightmare. So I know that when I got here, I probably wasn't this clear on the timeline. But now the clarity. When that was happening, I was here. So Attorney Earl Carroll advised me to agree to guardianship that was emergency guardianship by the agency MDS. Now at the same time, I was the client of Morgan & Morgan. See, before being evicted from my home, I had become a client of Morgan & Morgan, and I was putting a lawsuit against Monadnock Developmental Services because I was a client of theirs that had received no disability modifications to my home, had received no therapy appointments, and I was supposed to be 100% physically recovered guaranteed. According to the UMass documents, 100% physical guarantee. The cognitive was unknown and would take 2 years before neuro-eval could be done, and that's what was hidden and evaded. So knowing that, Morgan & Morgan was representing me, and then suddenly, MDS did the emergency guardianship, and Earl Carroll told me I should agree to guardians, which I trusted him and did. And apparently there was a lawsuit settlement between myself and MDS, as Morgan & Morgan represented me for that medical neglect that was aggressive, destroying half my body. Apparently there was a settlement. But I'm not permitted to know anything about that because I agreed to have a guardian. The guardian that took over at that time ended up being Office of Public Guardianship, the state of New Hampshire, and a trust account was formed in my name. And there's court rulings where I'm not permitted access to the trust accounts, to ledgers of Health and Human Services funding delegated in my name since the injury. And everyone about my Morgan & Morgan settlement between myself and MDS for aggressive neglect creating permanent physical disabilities has disappeared. Or it's in a trust account that's protected by court rulings because my medical condition is a trust account in my name, so only the board members of the trust account can give information about that, according to court rulings in place. Now, those board members, I don't have the right to know who they are either, like the ledgers, without an attorney. And no New Hampshire attorney seems to have the capacity to represent me. The microcosm of corruption. Again, all this goes back to the same singularity. 5 years ago when I got here, the same point. I was trying to bring focus to the unlawful ruling that was acquired while the patient of a hospital, the court made an unlawful ruling violating my human rights, which have been stomped on since. So 5 years ago, New Hampshire attorney told me to get a guardian to help with that, and the guardians helped the people that were stomping on my human rights and stole my home. So instead of protecting my home, Earl Carroll evaded and had me manipulated while vulnerable to go with assisting Roger LeComte in the theft of my home. That's what Earl Carroll did as a New Hampshire attorney. So I'm still waiting for human rights restoration and will continue asking the public to bring attention to this network operating in New Hampshire with organized judicial misusing by means of medical fraud, destroying lives of our vulnerable for the theft of federal funding. Until human rights restoration. It'll be daily.